So this is one of the most common questions you'll get in interviews. Give me your greatest strength and weakness. The hardest half is the weakness part. I've made mistakes in the past of being honest about it, actually giving my greatest weaknesses, and that's not something you want to do, apparently. So Obama's approach is to give a legitimate but sort of menial, insignificant weakness that you can easily overlook, and then kind of show how that plays into his greatest strength. So his example is pieces of paper. He easily loses track of small things, small, whatever, pieces of paper, because he's a big picture guy, big picture thinker. So it's a weakness, small weakness you can overlook, and it really highlights his strength. It plays into his strength. So it's the approach he uses. Edwards, I don't think anyone practiced questions with him because his answer sucked. He does what apparently a lot of people do. I don't understand why, but they take their strength and they just call it a weakness. In his case is kind of funny because he's followed by Clinton, whose greatest strength is Edwards' greatest weakness, which is compassion. Edwards is a compassionate guy, and sometimes he gets a little emotional about it, and it gets in the way of what he's trying to do. So if you want to go that approach, you can. A lot of people do. I guess it works for some people. Clinton's answer was the best, I thought. She didn't have an earpiece in back in 2008. She certainly did in 2016. But hers was that she's impatient and she gets frustrated with people, which is a legitimate weakness. It's probably not her greatest weakness, but it's a legitimate weakness, and she sort of turns it into a strength by saying she quite often pushes people to get harder and to go faster than they're ready to go. But gosh darn it. So she gives a legitimate weakness and then turns it into a strength. So I think the key point in this type of question is don't be honest. Well, don't be all of them but Edwards had honest answers. It's just a matter of how you frame it. So, give a weakness and then turn it into a strength. That's how you're supposed to answer these questions. So here is the debate.
You said each of you have strengths and weaknesses. I want to ask each of you quickly. Your greatest strength, your greatest weakness.
My greatest strength, I think, is the ability to bring people together from different perspectives, to get them to recognize what they have in common and to move people in a different direction. And as I indicated before, my greatest weakness, I think, is that when it comes to, I'll give you a very good example. I ask my staff never to hand me paper until 2 seconds before I need it, because I will lose it. And my desk in my office doesn't look good. I've got to have somebody around me who is keeping track of that stuff. And that's not trivial. I need to have good people in place who can make sure that systems run. That's what I've always done, and that's why we've run not only a good campaign, but a good U.S. Senate office.
Senator Edwards, greatest strength, greatest weakness.
I think my greatest strength is that for 54 years I've been fighting with every fiber of my being. In the beginning, the fight was for me. Growing up in mill towns and mill villages, I had to literally fight to survive. But then I spent 20 years in courtrooms fighting for children and families against really powerful, well-financed interests. I learned from that experience, by the way, that if you're tough enough and you're strong enough and you got the guts and you're smart enough, you can win. That's a fight that can be won. It can be won in Washington, too, by the way. And I've continued that fight my entire time in public life. So I've got what it takes inside to fight on behalf of the American people and on behalf of the middle class. I think weakness, I sometimes have a very powerful emotional response to pain that I see around me. When I see a man like Donnie Ingram, who I met a few months ago in South Carolina, who worked for 33 years in the mill, reminded me very much of the kind of people that I grew up with, who's about to lose his job, has no idea where he's going to go, what he's going to do. I mean, his dignity and self-respect is at issue, and I feel that in a really personal way and in a very emotional way, and I think sometimes that can undermine what you need to do.
Senator Clinton.
Well, I am passionately committed to this country and what it stands for. I'm a product of the changes that have already occurred, and I want to be an instrument for making those changes alive and real in the lives of Americans, particularly children. That's what I've done for 35 years. It is really my life's work. It is something that comes out of my own experience, both in my family and in my church, that, you know, I've been blessed. And I think to whom much is given, much is expected. So I have tried to create opportunities, both on an individual basis, intervening to help people who have nowhere else to turn, to be their champion, and then to make those changes. And I think I can deliver change. I think I understand how to make it possible for more people to live up to their God-given potential. I get impatient. I get, you know, really frustrated when people don't seem to understand that we can do so much more to help each other. And sometimes I come across that way. I admit that. I get very concerned about, you know, pushing further and faster than perhaps people are ready to go. But I think that, you know, there is a difference here. You know, I do think that being president is the chief executive officer. And I respect what Barack said about setting the vision, setting the tone, bringing people together. But I think you have to be able to manage and run the bureaucracy. You've got to pick good people, certainly, but you have to hold them accountable every single day. We've seen the results of a president who, frankly, failed at that. You know, he went into office saying he was going to have the kind of Harvard Business School CEO model where he'd set the tone, he'd set the goals, and then everybody else would have to implement it. And we saw the failures. We saw the failures along the Gulf Coast with, you know, people who were totally incompetent and insensitive, failing to help our fellow Americans. We've seen the failures with holding the administration accountable with the no-bid contracts and the cronyism. So I do think you have to do both. It's a really hard job. And in America, we put, you know, the head of state and the head of government together in one person. But I think you've got to set the tone, you've got to set the vision, you've got to set the goals, you've got to bring the country together, and then you do have to manage and operate and hold that bureaucracy accountable to get the results you're trying to achieve.
Senator Obama, Senator Clinton, invoke your name. I'll give you a chance to respond.
Well, there's no doubt that you've got to be a good manager, and that's not what I was arguing. The point in terms of bringing together a team is that you get the best people and you're able to execute and hold them accountable. But I think that there's something, if we're going to evaluate George Bush and his failures as president, that I think are much more important. He was very efficient. He was on time all the time, and you know, had, you know, I'm sure he never lost a paper. I'm sure he knows where it is. What he could not do is to listen to perspectives that didn't agree with his ideological predispositions. What he could not do is to bring in different people with different perspectives and get them to work together. What he could not do is to manage the effort to make sure that the American people understood that if we're going to go into war, that there are going to be consequences and there are going to be costs, and we have to be able to communicate what those costs are, and to make absolutely certain that if we're going to make a decision to send our young men and women into harm's way, that it's based on the best intelligence and that we've asked tough questions before we went into fight. I mean, those are the kinds of failures that have to do with judgment, they have to do with vision, the capacity to inspire people. They don't have to do with whether or not he was managing the bureaucracy properly. That's not to deny that there has to be strong management skills in the presidency. It is to say that what has been missing is the ability to bring people together, to mobilize the country, to move us in a better direction, and to be straight with the American people. That's how you get the American people involved.
Time for the rebuttal has